Okay, we'll begin. Be'ezus Hashem. Today's daf is Masechta Bava Metzia, daf Tzadik Aleph 91, and we're gonna start from daf Tzadik.
From the beginning.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay, hold on. Yeah, I'm in it. Hi Sheldon. Hi Lewis. We're just beginning. Tzadik.
Okay.
So what we're discussing is a very interesting topic today. We're discussing the Isser of Loy Sachshem Shor B'disha. Here it is on the screen. The Torah tells us that you are not allowed to muzzle your ox while it's threshing. Okay? So the Gemara has a question. Gemara says, Boy Minei Rabbi Yonasan Rabbi Simoi. Rabbi Yonasan asked a question from Rabbi Simoi. Chamasa mi b'chutz mahu. What happens if you muzzle the animal prior to bringing it into the room where it's doing the threshing? The Torah says don't muzzle the animal while it's threshing. So the way I understand the pasuk, it's telling you that while it's threshing, don't put a muzzle onto the animal. But what happens if I put the muzzle outside and then bring the animal already muzzled into the room where it's going to do the threshing? Mahu, what's the din? Sure, B'disha Amarachmana, was the Torah strict in saying that the ox, while it's threshing, don't put a muzzle on it. V'olah b'dishayu. But when you put the muzzle, it wasn't threshing yet, right? It was on the outside. Or Dilma loy todish b'chasima Amarachmana. The Torah says don't thresh while it's muzzled. So it doesn't matter if you muzzled it outside the room and then brought it into the room. It still would be a problem. So Rabbi Yonasan asked this question for Rabbi Simai. So Rabbi Simai was a kohen. So Amalei, Rabbi Yonasan was a kohen. Pardon me. Rabbi Yonasan was a kohen. Amalei. So Rabbi Simai responded to Rabbi Yonasan, "Mebeis avicha atalamed." You could learn it from the halachas of your family. What your family was a kohen. So learn the answer to your question for something that was similar in your family. What was similar? The Torah tells us that a kohen is not allowed to do malacha, that not allowed to do the service in the Beis Hamikdash if it drank wine. Yayin v'shecher al teish, don't drink wine or anything alcoholic. You and your children, itach b'vayachim, when you're coming into the Beis Hamikdash to serve. So now, what that implies, if you read that pasuk, means they can't drink in the Beis Hamikdash. You can't bring a wine bottle into the Beis Hamikdash and do the service. What happens if they get drunk outside? Can they do the service? But if you're going to read the pasuk literally, when you're walking into the Beis Hamikdash, then it's prohibited. Hamishto mayo shari, but to drink wine outside the Beis Hamikdash, get tipsy outside the Beis Hamikdash, and then go into the Beis Hamikdash, would that be permitted? That doesn't make sense, because the Torah says that the Torah requires you to make a differentiation between holy work and non-sacred work. And if you come in drunk to do the holy work, that's not a separation. So clearly, the Torah was meant to say, Ella, mahosam, just like over there, b'shas bia, when you're doing the service, loitei b'shechris, the Torah, it says, don't be intoxicated. So that's when you're doing the service. It doesn't matter where you're drinking, whether you're drinking in the Beis Hamikdash or outside the Beis Hamikdash. So now, hachanami, same here, we can resolve it too. The Torah was concerned that the animal will be in pain if it's muzzled. So make sure, it doesn't matter where you muzzle the animal, in the room or outside the room. The Torah was concerned that while it's threshing, it should not be muzzled. So therefore, even if you muzzled it outside, it still would be prohibited. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, let's say you muzzled the cow, but then somebody else was doing the threshing. Somebody else took the muzzled cow and brought it into the threshing room. So the muzzler didn't do the Avera. It's the one that brought it into the threshing room that did the Avera. The same thing over here. Let's say you hooked up two different types of animal. Let's say an ox and a donkey to a wagon, but it didn't move. You just harnessed them to a wagon. So potter, the one that did that is not held liable. The Eina Loika, you don't get Malchus Eladosh, the one that actually brings the animal that's muzzled to thresh, Umanig Babad, and the one that is actually moves the animal the Kalayim pair starts to move and move the wagon. That's the person that gets the Avera, not the one that harnessed it to the wagon. Now the Gemara asks a very interesting question. Okay, you're not allowed to muzzle an animal. Let's say I don't muzzle it, but every time I see the animal bending down to eat, I give a scream, and the animal gets scared and doesn't eat. Did you get an Avera? You get the Malchus for that. Itmar, Chasama Bakal. You muzzle the animal by screaming, by using your sound. Benhiga Bakal. Or the same thing. You have an animal that's an ox and a donkey, and you're not guiding those animals together to pull the wagon, but you're screaming at them, and that's how they're moving together. So anyway, Rabbi Yochanan says Chayev. Rav Shlokish says Amapata. Rabbi Yochanan says Chayev, you're held liable because Akimas Piv Havamasa. By moving your mouth, you're effectuating an action, and therefore, it's like the lav, and you would get malchus for that because you're doing an action. Rav Shlokish says Potter. That's not. You're not held liable, and you don't get malchus because kola loy have a masa. By making a sound with your mouth, that's not considered you did an action. The only time you'll get malchus for muzzling an animal if you actually put on a muzzle to the animal, but making a noise and blocking it and scaring it from eating, that's not called an action. And in order to get malchus, you need to have an action to it. Like, eating a nevela. Eating is an action. So Esrei Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan asked the question of Rish Lakish. We go to Tzadik Aleph. Loy she'adam rashoy lahamir. The Brisa says that a person is not allowed to substitute a holy animal for a non-holy animal. If you have a holy animal that's destined to be a korban, and you're saying, oh, this animal should be a substitute for that animal, the Torah says you get an avera for that. So you're not allowed to do that. You have to leave the animal that's the way it is, and you can't say, I'm substituting this animal for that animal. And the Torah says, the Brisa says, if you substitute an animal, the substitution takes effect, and both the original animal remains holy, and the one that you call that should be a substitute, the Tamura, also remains holy. But v'soifig is huaboim, you get Malchus 40. Now, why would you get Malchus? Because you did an Avera. The Torah says, don't do that, and you did it. But how are you doing it? Moving your mouth. So we see that moving your mouth is considered an action, because otherwise, you would not get Malchus. So this is a question against Rish Lakish. Amalei, because Rish Lakish holds moving your mouth is not considered an action. Amalei, so Rish Lakish will answer, Hamani, the author of that brisa, is Rabbi Yehudi, is Rabbi Yehudi. The Amma, lav she'ein b'maisa, like a love, that even if you don't do an action, you will still get Malchus. If you do a mlav, that there's no action, you still get Malchus. That's a unique shita. Umi omatzas Michaelis Rabbi Yehuda. Can you say that brisa goes according to Rabbi Yehuda? V'katani reisha, but the beginning of the brisa does not agree with Rabbi Yehuda. So how could this part of the brisa be Rabbi Yehuda? The brisa says, "Hakol mimririm." Everybody can effectuate the tumura, the substitution. Echad nashim v'echad nashim. Both men and women could be liable for this aver if they do it. V'avinamba. We asked the question, "Hakol latu yemai." What is the hakol, including everybody? And then you list off men and women. Who else did you leave out? Last 2 yarish, that if you inherit an animal, if a man inherited a korban from his father was separated a korban and then died. So the son, if he goes and makes a substitute for that korban, he could be over. So that's what that includes, that you get an avera for that. So that beginning of the brisa is the like Rabbi Yehuda. That obviously does not go according to Rabbi Yehuda. The ik Rabbi Yehuda, because if that went according to Rabbi Yehuda, ha'amar Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion yorish eina meimer, yorish eina seimer. If you inherit an animal, you can't be liable for tumura, and you don't have to do smicha. So we see that the beginning of the brisa doesn't go according to Rabbi Yehuda. So how could you tell me that the end of the brisa goes according to Rabbi Yehuda, who holds lav shein by maisa like an olive? So the Gemara says, very simple, Hi Tana, this author of this brisa, Sovala Kavase Bechada, Upalagala Bechada. The author of the brisa is an individual person. He picks and chooses what opinion he aligns himself with Rabbi Yehuda. He aligns himself with Rabbi Yehuda, who said that lav shein by maisa, even if you don't do an action, you get malchus. Upalig alei bechada, but he disagreed with Rabbi Yehuda in one, because Rabbi Yehuda holds a Yorish does not have Tamura, and this brisa holds Yorish does have Tamura. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught. Now, here's a new question. Let's say you rented a cow. Okay, you rented a cow and you muzzled the cow. So you muzzle the cow, you get malchus. But now you owe the cow didn't eat lunch, and you were required when you muzzled the cow, you were responsible for the cow eating some of that threshing food. So you really owe the money to the owner of the cow. So the Brisa says a big chiddush. If you muzzle the cow that you rented, the dashba, and you threshed your animal with it. So first of all, like you get malchus because you muzzled the animal. And you also pay the owner 4 calves of food for if you rented a cow, or 3 calves if you rented a chamar. In other words, that's the lunch, that's the food that the cow would have eaten or the donkey would have eaten during the threshing process. But you still have to pay the owner because now the owner now has to feed the animal. So the Gemara says, so you see a very interesting thing. The guy's going to get lashed, and also he's going to have to write a check. But the Gemara, we don't find that. A person doesn't get malchus and chayiv misa. It's one or the other. When you get a punishment through bezdin, it's malchus or death. The eino loike u'mishalim, and you don't get malchus and pay. Right? So once you're chayiv malchus for muzzling the animals, why should you have to pay the owner of the cow, the dalit kalbim, for the lunch to pay for the food that you prevented the cow from eating? Answers the Gemara, Homani, Rabbi explained, Homani, the author of the Brisa is Rabbi Meir. The Omar who said, Loike u'mishalim, sometimes you get malchus and you'll be forced to pay. That's what that Rabbi's answer is. Rava says, really, you don't have to pay. Rava's answer is like this: you really don't have to pay. But sometimes if you want to be yaitzel l'dei shamayim, if you want to be yaitzel l'dei shamayim, so then the Torah, then you could have to pay. Then you should pay. And he says a very funny thing. Let's say when you have relations with a prostitute, you pay the money, right? That's called esnan, the payment for that. If a person and you really should pay for that service because that was your commitment. But if, let's say, a person was mizana, had relations with his mother, so he's chayiv misa. But let's say he committed to his mother a payment. So if you're going to pay her for the service, then that payment is called esnan. And of course, the mother cannot. If you paid her a sheep, that the Torah tells us that cannot be brought as a carbon. So we see a concept that although you're going to get misa, you're going to get death, but if you want to be yaitzel l'dei shamayim, you should pay the fine too. You should pay them the amount owed, your commitment. So the same thing over here. Rava Amma Esnan Asr Torah, the Torah answered to a payment to a prostitute, and even if you came to your mother and was mizana with your mother and you chayav misa, still, if you want to be yaitzel l'dei shamayim, you should pay your mother. That was the commitment. And therefore, that's what we're talking about. You're right, you get the malchus, but if you want to make sure that you want to cross all bases, then you get extra reward extra forgiveness if you pay the owner of the cow what the deprived food that you deprived his cow. Rav Papa says a new simpler teretz. He says that really, here you would get malchus and pay. Why? Normally you don't get paid. You don't get malchus and pay if they come at the same time. But here the two averas came at different times. Mishas Mashicha Ichayv Leibimzainaseha from the time that you took possession of the cow, you were obligated to feed it lunch. And the malchus came much later when you did the muzzling. So they didn't come at the same time. So that's why over here, you're going to get 2 punishments, the malchus and the payment. So 3 terutzim on how to answer that brisa. Nu Gemara. Amar Papa said, Hane mili boy mene de be Papa bar abi upashita leil yisura chada kehilchasa chada loy kehilchasa. Papa said that Papa bar Abba asked me 2 questions, and I said, Aser. But one, I was right. I did the halacha, and one I was wrong. Listen to these questions, and you're probably familiar with these questions. Boy Menei, Rapapa Bar Abba asked Rapapa, can I make a dough out of milk? Milchige bread. And he passed them to me I said to him, you're not allowed to. And that's the halacha. The Tanya, we learned in a brayso, a lashon is isa b'chalav. You're not allowed to make a bread out of milk, a milchiga bread. The imlash, if you did do that, kol pas kula asura. The whole bread is the whole loaf of bread is asur. The penei hergel avera, because it could lead to an avera. If you have milchiga bread and you want to have a salami sandwich with it, it's basar b'chalav. So they didn't want you. They asked you to make milchiga bread. This also gives a problem, let's say, for Thomas English's muffin, which is milchiks, right? So how does the OU give a hechsher on that? And that's the halacha. We don't make big breads out of milchiks. The answer is big breads we don't make, but small little muffins, which look like breakfast things, then they rely on a leniency to make it milchiks. But really, you shouldn't have milchiga bread. And same thing, you shouldn't have fleishiga bread. We learned a similar thing. You don't smear an oven out of the animal fat. If you did smear it, so then if you bake a bread in that oven, the bread will be fleishiks, kolapas kula asura. The entire bread will be totally asur. Achiyasik is a tanner until you fire up, until you kasher the oven, it will remain asur. So that was one question. Another question they asked Rav Papa. Now it's a very interesting question. You're not allowed to crossbreed two animals from different types. So the question is, can I bring one type with its not type into a pen? By forcing them to be in a pen, and maybe it's going to lead them to mate with each other. But you didn't actually mate them. They're going to mate with each other by you forcing them in that pen. The Torah says don't mate, but maybe the Torah is referring to that you're going to take the organ of the male and bring it into the female. That's called the isser of crossbreeding kalayim. But just to put them in a pen by itself, maybe that would be permitted. So they asked Rav Papa this question. Rav Papa said this is not permitted. And that's the lav kehilchasa. That's not the halacha. The Amar Shmuel said, uva menafim ach yira kedar chamanafim, uva kalayim ach yaknas kimchol b'sheferes. Rabbi Shmuel said that if crossbreeding means that you, in order to be over the lav, to transgress the lav of crossbreeding, you have to take the male organ of, let's say, the donkey and stick it into the ox or whatever, the opposite. But that's the only way to crossbreed. Other than that, you're not. And kimchol b'sheferes is like a brush in a tube. That was a nice way of saying that. So Mosif Rav Achtevoy Bar Ami, so Rav Achte Bar Ami asked the question from a brisa. The brisa seems to say that even putting them in a pen would be asur, because the brisa says if the Torah says don't mate an animal, I would think that the Torah says that any animal, I can't make animals mate. You can't hold a female animal when the male is mounting on her. So hold it down, the animal, so that it can stay straight. So I would think you're not allowed to do that to any animals. Talmud loy mekalayim. It's only when they're not the same type of animals. Let's say an ox mating with a donkey. So la mechlal, the klayim achiza nami loy. So we see that klayim, even holding on to the female, is asar. So the Gemara wants to derive that even so, putting them in the same pen would also be an isser. Not like you said, like Shmuel said, that the isser was actually holding on to the male organ and bringing it into the female. So that's what the brisa seems to apply. So the Gemara says, "Mayachiza," you misunderstood the brisa. Hachnasa. The brisa means that you're bringing the male organ into the female. What does the brisa call it? Holding on to the animal. It's a finer way of saying it. Amar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, I'm allowed to mate animals if I'm in the business, and not only that, take the organ of the male and stick it into the female. Now, what's the problem with that? If they're both the same type, there should be no problem. The problem is that this might lead to sinful thoughts. So Rav Yehuda said, there's no problem of having sinful thoughts. You're busy with your work. That's your work. So therefore, you're not thinking in that direction. It's like a doctor. working. So you're not thinking in that mode, and therefore it's permitted. So says the Gemara, O Mosav Rav Achterboy Bar Ami. So Rav Achterboy Bar Ami asked the question. We go to Tzadik Aleph on the base. If the Torah would have said, if the Brisa says, if it says don't mate animals, you're not allowed to hold on to the female if the male is going to mount onto her. So Talmud Loy Kalayim, the Torah says only if it's two different types. Kalayim hu da'asar. Kalayim, you're not allowed to hold on to the animal. Ha mi shari. But with a mean b'minoi, that's it's permitted. Umin b'minoi achiza in hachnasaloi. But only if it's the same type of animal, you're only allowed to hold on. But to actually take the male organ and stick it into the female, even if it's min b'minoi, the Brisa didn't give you a permission because maybe the Brisa holds you'll have sinful thoughts. So the Gemara says, no, my achiza achnasa. The Brisa agrees. You're allowed to hold on to the animal and hold on to the male organ and stick it to the female. Why does the Brisa call it holding on to the female? It's a nice way of saying it, but it's not what the Brisa means. Amar Ravashi. Ravashi goes even further. Hamil sebaymene debeirav from Nehemiah Reish Galisa. They asked the question to the yeshiva boys. Asked Reb Nehemiah the Reish Galusa, "Ma'al lahachnes? Can I bring into a pen min minoi, two of the same type, v'she'ena minoi, and one of the different type, ledir to a pen?" So kevin the ika minoi, since you have three animals in there, and one of them is the same type of the animal. Let's say you have two oxen and one donkey. So basamina garat. So it's gonna be drawn to its type. Oidilma afilah hachilai. Maybe in that case, maybe it'll go to its opposite type. It's something that's not its type. So you're causing kalayim to mate. Upshitale, and he paskin li isura delay kilchasa mishum pritzis da'ade. Really, it's asa. He said it's asa. That's not really the halacha, but he said because slaves, when they see two of the same type and one of the different type, the slave that work for you are going to, because they're immoral, they're going to take and mate the mean b'she'ena mina. So he asked them from putting them into the same pen. Says the Mishnah, we know a worker can eat on the job, but let's say the worker is working with his hands, but not his feet, or his feet and not his hand. Even if he's schlepping, the fruits he can eat on the job. Remember, the pasuk says right over here, if you're working in your friend's vineyard, you can eat any of the grapes as much as you want. It doesn't mean that you're working cutting the grapes, but even if you're just schlepping boxes of grapes in that capacity, you're still allowed to eat. You're as a worker. You're free to take. The only time you're allowed to eat is if you're working on behalf of your employer with your hands and feet. You have to be moving all parts of your body. So we're going to see what that means. Why tama? What's the reason of the Tanakama? Because the Torah says, the Torah says when you go into your friends to work for your friend's vineyard, anything that you do, you have permission to eat with the grapes. That the only time you're allowed to eat is unless you're working with your hands and feet. My time with Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. Why is the reason of Rabbi Yosef Yehuda? That means the only time a worker could take kanash is only if he's working with his hands and feet. Let's say he's holding something down with his feet and cutting with his arms. That's the only time you're allowed to eat from the fruits of your employer. What's the reason? Because the answer is basically a worker eating is like the isser of not muzzling your animal. They're both similar. Kishar. So the worker is like the ox. Mashar, just like a shar, when it's threshing with all four legs. So achiyasa b'yadav v'raglav, it's doing with the four legs and hind legs. Apoyel, the only time a worker can eat achiyasa b'yadav v'raglav, unless he's working with both his hands and feet. If he's not, then he's not permitted to partake in his employer's food. Now the Gemara asks a question. Okay, you tell me you have to work with your hands and feet. If a person was threshing with geese and chickens, according to Rabbi Yosef Yehuda, that you have to work with your hands and feet. Well, a chicken or a goose does not have feet; it just has hands. It just has feet. So, does Rabbi Yosef Yehuda want that you work with your entire energy? And that's the truth, that the chicken is working with its entire energy. Dilma, but maybe beyond the varagla be'inim v'holeka. But maybe the emphasis is that it has to work with your hands and feet like an ox, and a chicken doesn't have a hand, so therefore there would a chicken would not be allowed to. There would be no issa muzzling a chicken. Teku Gemara says remains a question. One more piece. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Abahu. Rav Nachman and Rav Abahu said, "Pay alim." You're only allowed to eat if you have grapes in a wine press, so you're allowed to eat those grapes. But if you made wine, you're not allowed to eat because you're only allowed to eat only the foods that you're working with. And right now it's grapes, and therefore you could eat grapes and not wine. But once you stepped and walked crosswise and lengthwise, so you're ready, like Lucy made some wine there, so you could eat. The worker can eat grapes, or if he wants to take a sip of the grape juice. Let's do the Mishnah and then we'll stop. One more minute. Look the Mishnah. Mishnah says a worker is allowed to eat, right? But let's say the worker is working with figs, and the owner has a vine that has grapes. He's not allowed to eat grapes because your job is in the figs, not with the grapes. You're only allowed to eat what you're working with. Ba'anovim, if you're working with grapes, you're not allowed to eat the figs because you're not working with the figs. You were hired to work with the grapes. But the worker can, he can hold himself back and say, I'm going to wait till I see the best grapes and eat those best grapes. And the owner can say, no, eat the inferior grapes. No, the worker can say, I'm holding myself back and keeping an empty stomach till I eat your best grapes. The kulan like amru, and the Mishnah ends off and says, the worker can eat only while he's working. But let's say after the job, or right before he starts the job, he's not allowed to eat, obviously. Aval mishum hashev aveda, but to protect the owner, lebailim, amru pa'alim eichlim ali kosim umla. That if the worker, if we allow the worker to eat, then he's not going to work so well. So therefore, in between going from one row of grapes, let's say one row, and he's walking to the next row, during that time where he's not actually working, he can eat. Even though technically in Torah, he's not allowed to eat, but the Rabbanan said that the owner would want him to eat at that time, so by the time he starts working in the second row, he's full of strength again. So therefore, that would be permitted. And when they're returning from the wine press. And when the chamar could eat, up until when you unload the donkey. And we're going to see more about that, the explanation of that in the Gemara. But we'll stop over here right after the Mishnah. Okay? Okay, we'll stop right here.
Sure.